Kerrie Droban, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Or should I say, welcome back to the show?
I know, multiple topics, huh?
Yes, it's funny how life works that way. I wanted to do a podcast for a while regarding divorce, but I didn't want to do it solo. And I thought to myself, well, who do I know that is a family law attorney and was married to a former homicide detective? And I'm like, Kerrie Droban, of course. So, hey, thank you.
I know, a winning combination.
Yes, well, and I wanted, a different perspective. Nobody wants to hear just me. So I wanted to hear, you're a mom, you've been through divorce, and you've seen a lot of divorces because, that's what you do. So I thought, what a best, just such a good combination. So I'm excited about this. I think it's going to be great.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start out with, divorce, and more specifically, divorce in law enforcement. The American Psychological Association came out with a little study in January of 21, and they're saying that the divorce rate in America is about 50%, and the divorce rate amongst cops or law enforcement is 70%. And they kind of had the caveat of it might be a lot higher. Obviously these things are subjective sometimes and it's numbers. Does that sound about right for you, in your practice?
Yes, definitely. I mean, particularly in, I would put military in that same category as
Yes.
law enforcement. I mean, they're very similar. And I think it's really just, I mean, in many ways, I think the whole, being married to a law enforcement officer or military person, the spouse really has to walk into that with eyes wide open, because that is a lifestyle that is so taxing, not only on the law enforcement officer, but on the spouse walking into it. So and I just don't think there's a lot of education on that. There's definitely not a lot of training. I mean, when I attended the academy graduation with my ex-husband, they had a person there who gave a lecture to everybody in the room, and they said, look around you, because there's like, the person next to you is probably not going to be married within like a few years. So it was a pretty sobering thought. Like, oh my God.
Yeah,
So I'm like, all right. So,
yeah, when you walk into a marriage, your thought is hopefully not divorce. It should be till death do us part, but it always doesn't work out that way. And I had something similar like that happen to me, but not with my ex. It was our first day in the academy, and I forget who it was, but it was one of the zillion guest speakers that came in, and he's like, okay, divorce in America, about 50% divorce rate. He says, okay, congratulations, now you're cops. He said, now it's about 70-80%. And if you're stupid enough to marry another cop, now it's 90. And
yeah.
and we all looked at each other like, I thought it would have been better if you were married to another cop. And they're like, no, because that's all you do is talk about cop stuff.
You talk shop. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, my ex and I had a rule. We had a family rule. We were never to talk shop at home, because I was a lawyer, and I started out as a prosecutor, so we were on the same side, and then I
Right.
became a criminal defense attorney. So then I moved to the dark side. So we were like the Hill Street Blues couple. And then of course, I went into family law. So we just had a blanket rule. We don't talk about work. But the problem with that is, then what do you talk about? Because that's such a, that's an outlet for you. And you need to be able to have that sounding board or that person. Well, then you compound that with undercover work. And you've got somebody who's working undercover, cannot tell you anything. And now you're like, not even involved in their part of their life that is so stressful and traumatic, and they can't even share it with their spouse. So that's, a double whammy.
Yeah, that's super tough. And you don't even have to be doing undercover work because, it's like, okay, I went to the crib death today. That was my day. That was my Tuesday. Yeah, and it's like, how do you go home and even like start to talk about something like that? Or, you saw the guy that was shot a gazillion times, or, there was a statistic, I forget where it came from, but police officers, and I think they lump, first responders like firefighters and all that, they see about 7 to 900 critical incidents in the span of, say, a 25, 30-year career. And the average citizen sees about three or four.
Yeah, it's awful. And they will see it on television. So there's that buffer, whereas a police officer will see it firsthand. I mean, I just remember one pretty stunning conversation that my ex and I had around the kitchen counter. And we were talking about blood spatter and
Okay.
all of the different ways that blood talks to people. And I
Oh,
thought,
right. Yeah. It's
I'm like,
fascinating.
wow, we're talking, like, we're actually having a conversation about this. And I had to stop and think, wow, this is really weird. This is really not normal to have a conversation about the direction of blood and how you can tell, where someone shot, where it's like landing on the wall. I mean, it's really, it's pretty telling.
Yeah. I guess one thing that jumps out at me is when you look back on your own divorce. Full disclosure, I got divorced. It started in 11 and we are finally done with it in 2013. It was 2 years of just complete agony. It was horrible. And looking back, it shouldn't have been that way. That's where, if anything, that if somebody gets anything out of this conversation, I would say, please, if it's inevitable and you're getting divorced, there's no getting around it, get good attorneys.
Mhm.
Because, they may not always tell you what you want to hear, but a good attorney will steer you in the right direction. They are a counselor, hey, counselor, and you're not going to be thinking completely straight, but you have to have realistic expectations for what your life and your kids' lives are going to be post divorce. And chasing dollar signs or just crazy ideas, all it does is hurt everybody.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think probably the most important thing you said there was having realistic expectations, because I think I always start off by telling clients that divorce is not rocket science. So it's not as if it's complicated. I mean, some cases are complicated, but for the most part, it's so emotionally charged that you cannot see straight, and that's
Right.
really the reason to hire a lawyer. I mean, you're talking about the most important assets in your life, your children, your property, your financial stability, all of that. Why would you do it yourself? But incredibly, a lot of people do. And so I think it's really a mistake. And I know that, attorneys charge a lot. They charge a lot because it's emotionally draining and difficult and stressful, but they also get the job done. And you're absolutely right. It's like if you hire a good one, then trust the advice that you're getting from that lawyer, and don't waste your time fighting over things that you're not going to prevail in the court of law. I mean, that's really the advantage of having a lawyer, is knowing what you can and can't fight for, and remembering the children at the heart of it. If you have kids, like, they're going to live with this legacy, and they're looking to you to see how you're navigating this landmine. And if you're at war with each other and hating each other, they're learning from that, and the children will pick sides, and that can be probably the most devastating outcome of divorce.
So what's your advice for somebody that is like, okay, this is looming on the horizon here, I need to get an attorney. How do you find one that, and you trust? And for me, what I did was I asked, being a cop, there's plenty of people around me that have been divorced. And I picked the two guys that went through the worst divorces I've ever heard about. I mean, like burning clothes on the front yard, just crazy, crazy, nutty stuff. And I'm like, and they came out of it okay. You know, you never come out of it 100%. It's a divorce. There's going to be some collateral damage, but they did come out of it as whole as could be expected. So I'm like, okay, I want that attorney representing me because mine hopefully won't be that bad. So what do you suggest?
Well, I think you make a good point. I mean, I would definitely start first with a referral, because it's always good to have somebody who knows somebody and they did a good job, and then they refer you. It's hard to just pick somebody out of whole cloth, out of going on the internet and just looking at
Right.
at their face and deciding whether that's a good fit, because you don't want to be hiring a lawyer, then firing them, and then finding another one. So the other thing I would say is, as an attorney, your lawyer really needs to match you, your personality, because
Mm,
it's a relationship that you're having with them, and you're going to divulge probably the most sensitive information.
yeah,
Maybe you haven't even talked to your counselor about it, but you got
you're
to
right. Yep.
lawyer it. So you've got to really trust your lawyer and like them and be willing to disclose things, because I mean, in Arizona where I practice, I mean, if you don't disclose stuff, we don't do trial by ambush here, it comes back to bite you. So
Right.
everything has to be disclosed. So the last thing you want to do is withhold information from your lawyer. So I think that finding that perfect match before you start is really crucial. So interview the attorney that you're thinking of hiring. Don't just call them up and say, hey, I think I need a lawyer and I'm going to hire you. Like, find out something about their past and see how transparent they are, how much they share. And I also think, to your point, I think it is very worthwhile to have an attorney that has gone through a divorce. So they
Mm,
know what you've been through. They're
yeah.
very empathetic, sympathetic, and they can tell you, hey, this worked, and what works and doesn't work, because you really don't want to waste time going down a rabbit hole that isn't leading anywhere. So that's my advice.
Well, I think you touched something that I'm going to expound on, that I didn't even think about was interviewing your attorney. You don't think of that. It's like a doctor or a lawyer. Those are professions or vocations that, we kind of take people at their face value that they're going to be superstars at what they're doing. But like you said, it has to be a good match. I interviewed my guy. I brought a steno pad with me and a pen. I'm a cop. So I write, I interview people. So I went straight into cop mode and and before I even talked to him, I got his name. I looked at, Better Business Bureau, Google reviews, and there's another like review service that's specific for uh attorneys. I forget what it's called, but he had some stuff on there. I looked at his website and I had plenty of referrals, and I'm like, okay, everything looks great on paper, let's talk to this guy. So he starts talking to me, and right away we just clicked. He said, "You know what?" He said, "You seem like a nice guy." He said, "You know what? I've got a ton of money." He said, "I take my family on a vacation every year to Europe. The Mercedes out in front, that's mine." He said, "Grab a steno pad, go to Starbucks with your soon to be ex, hammer this out, be realistic, bring it back to me, and I'll see, where we're at." He's because, they're charging 350 bucks an hour to $300 an hour, whatever it is. And I did a lot of my own legwork that
Yeah.
sometimes people forget about. And you don't have to be a super cop or whatever. You know, a lot of the stuff you could just do on your own at your attorney's, guidance. So
Yeah.
you're gonna save some money that way. But we clicked, right away. I'm just like, oh yeah, this is my guy. But I will throw this one caveat out there. If you're going through a divorce, or if you're going to, or whatever, during that event, you as the divorce attorney, you're like one of my most important people on planet Earth, because you're navigating these shark infested waters where, like you said, this is going to affect you financially forever, but more importantly, your children. And you can't put a price tag on that. And it's like, I got to make sure I have the right person here, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and right away I knew that this guy wasn't like money hungry, he wasn't whatever. And you know what, there's public records of seeing where people have been sued, and that's including lawyers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I was just gonna say that's a good place to start too.
yep, and unfortunately my ex-wife did not start there, and she hired a guy that was horrible. There's no way around it. I mean, I looked at his I just looked him up through public records. I didn't use any super cool police stuff. It was just stuff that any citizen can do on the computer. And he had charge-offs for his Target credit card. He had tax liens. He got busted for drunk driving. I mean, there was just a whole slew of stuff. And I'm like, just looking at this, I would never hire this guy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's so I asked my wife, I said, well, we were married at the time, my soon to be ex. I'm like, hey, your attorney sucks. There's no nice way of putting it. And we had our first like meeting and he was so unprofessional and the suit he was wearing looked like he slept in it.
Yeah, it's the
And I'm just like,
combo effect.
and I'm like, well, you have to be professional. This is a profession. And he didn't talk like any lawyer that I knew. He was just, I'm like, is this guy working out of a broom closet? I mean, what's going on here? And my attorney's like, Pat, I've been practicing family law for over 20 years and I pretty much know everybody. I don't know this guy. I've never heard of him before. And I'm like, that's bad.
No, good sign.
Yeah.
Good sign. Yeah, no, it's very good to do your homework. I mean, I think that be a sleuth,
Yep.
investigate your attorney, make sure that they're going to be a good fit because you're right, you're going to spend a lot of time with them. I mean, divorces generally don't happen quickly, but I second what your attorney did, which is to task the client with get them thinking in the direction of like be proactive in their own divorce. So I don't ever like, I bring a client in and we will have a huddle over what the objective is, what the strategy is, but then I'll send them, to their soon to be ex and I'll say, see if you can have a conversation, especially if they have children together, because they want to be able to co-parent and have that communication and be able to, talk sensibly to one another. Sometimes it's not possible because they have so much animosity or
Right.
there are factors involved, but I think it's really good to sort of test those waters and see where the person is, because I always start out with that same thing, whereas don't pay your lawyer your children's college tuition. You know,
Right. Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
a there's a way not to do that. And so if you have a good lawyer, one who's got control over the case and can really navigate those waters, I would say, you'll walk away with at least some of the tuition still in your pocket.
I was saying that, you're the most important person to me at that point in my life because there's so much at stake. But looking back and helping other people go that have gone through divorces, and it's like, man, they didn't return my call, blah, 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 and they're sweating it. And I'm like, you're one of 10 or 20 clients that they have right now. You know, right
It,
now, you are not the center of their universe. I mean, they're the center of your universe right now. And you have to keep that in mind.
yeah, that's important, right? I mean, I think it's, it isn't a 9 to 5 job when
No,
you're a family law lawyer, or maybe any lawyer, but the clients are in crisis and they need company and help when they're in crisis. And so who do they reach for? They reach for their lawyer. And
yep,
sometimes that's late at night, sometimes that's early in the morning. And, not that every lawyer answers the call at those times, but
right.
at least, they're available. They can leave a message. They can, I mean, I always get back to people within a few hours because I know they're in crisis mode. They need answers.
Oh yeah, it's very, very stressful, that's for sure. But let's back up a little bit. As far as when do you feel like the divorce is looming on the horizon? I think we feel it in our guts. It's like, okay, something is wrong with this relationship, man, there's warning signs, but we're very good at ignoring those, as human beings, we're because we want to hopefully think the best and, oh no, this isn't going to happen to me, that type of thing. Some of the warning signs that are obvious that I think is, abrupt changes in behaviors. They're drinking a lot more, they're going out a lot more than they ever had before. They're not talking about the future where, like 6 months ago, you're talking about, yeah, this summer we're going to go on vacation X, Y, and Z, or man, I can't wait for, it's like, maybe you should go back to school and, get your bachelor's and whatever, get an accreditation and, whatever the case may be, where that kind of dissipates or it kind of disappears. You're like, that's a red flag.
Mhm.
And yeah, I would like to pick your brain a little bit. What do you think are some of the warning signs where people should really start thinking, this is starting to go south?
Well, I think the number one thing is really if your values are not on the same path. If you cannot, I mean, everybody. goes through, ebbs and flows in their
Right.
relationship.
Absolutely.
It's perfect. And I think though, to your point, if you are married to somebody in law enforcement, or you are in law enforcement, sometimes the circumstances of the job change a person. And there's no, the coping mechanisms or the things that they that are used in place of communication, the sleep deprivation, the stress, the anxiety, the secrecy, like the things that they're involved in that maybe they can't share anymore with their spouse. So those things start changing. And if there really is no way to reconcile those changes, then I think it's time to cut your losses and, move forward in your respective careers or lives, because it's not repairable if the core values have changed. And some of those things cannot be overcome. For example, I mean, I'm gonna just use my own experience where, I was in a very long marriage, 27 years. So that's a long time to
Yeah, mine was
stay.
23, so I know what you're feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I tried everything. I mean, you work through some of those issues
Hmm.
because, some of these factors they're variables that you really can't control, you're not aware of, and you can't plan for. So there's not this contingency plan. That's one of the things that is, it can be exciting but also terrifying when you embark on a marriage, because you don't know everything that's coming
Right.
around the corner, right? What if what if your career paths diverge? What if your spouse, as in my case, he worked several stints undercover and then he became a homicide detective. I mean, that wasn't in the plan when we got married, 27 years prior, right? So I was not prepared for any of those stressors. I wasn't prepared for the PTSD that followed, or the nights where he's on call, he's on a crime scene, he's on a search warrant. I mean, sometimes for weeks at a time where you don't see each other, so that communication starts to strain, and you're not in touch with each other, even though you can try to make date nights, you can try to do these things that keep the foundation together. But if the core values have disintegrated, there is no way to salvage that. And I think that's when you start to lose yourself, you start to lose your identity, and that disconnection is not repairable, then I think it's time to cut the losses, because otherwise you're essentially living somebody else's life. You're staying in a marriage and you're living someone else's life. And that's, essentially what happened to me. And so at
Okay.
that point, it's like, I've got to decide, am I going to save myself, my integrity, the life that I have left, or am I going to stay in this marriage? And I think, it's interesting, but I actually think the number one mistake that people make is staying for their children, because
Interesting. Okay.
your children, your children know what's going on, and they can feel that tension. They
Hmm.
can feel
They're
that
very
distress.
perceptive, very
Very
perceptive. Yeah.
perceptive. And it actually is very anxiety provoking for children. So whether you stay, for them, or whether you leave for them, I think the important distinction is you are leaving the marriage. You are not leaving them. So you're leaving the marriage because the marriage is no longer healthy, and it's no longer healthy for anybody in it. So in essence, you are dissolving a corporation. So if you want to look at it very clinically, a marriage is a contract between two people, and it's a corporate entity. And when you're dissolving it, you're finding the most efficient way, the most humane way to have everybody remain whole, but no longer part of that corporate entity. And then that's the tricky thing.
Yeah.
So
That makes total sense to me. But there are those circumstances where somebody's going to say, it's like, I'm staying married for the kids because my spouse isn't a good mother, isn't a good father, whatever. And, they might say, well, he or she is an alcoholic, or they're abusive, or whatever. And my answer to them all the time was, first, if you think that you're going to get divorced and you're going to get 100% placement of those kids because of X, Y, and Z, you better be able to prove it. And just because you have a feeling or you don't like the way they parent or whatever, that's not grounds for, them not seeing them, their mom or their dad 50% of the time. That's not going to happen. You're living in a dreamland, I think, but how do
Right,
you
yeah.
overcome that? Do you ever have anything like that happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, all the time, really. I mean, I have people that, will say, well, I don't think he's, he or she is an adequate parent. They're an unfit parent. And
Right.
so they go down that path. And in very rare cases is that true. And, the exceptions. And so first of all, there's what you can prove in a court of law.
Right.
And there's what is an opinion, right? And
Hmm.
so, oftentimes the judges have to sort of wade through that. They have to wade through the hostility, the animosity that the two people hate each other. But the bottom line is that person harming the child? What is in the best interest of the child? And the child, in most cases, loves both parents, faults and all.
Right.
So as long as that parent who's the alcoholic or who's, even in domestic violence cases, which, I don't necessarily agree with, but a court of law is not going to separate the child from their domestic violent parent unless that parent is abusive to the child. And I'm talking about physically abusive.
Right.
Mentally abusive is a whole nother ballgame, and it's not recognized in the court of law, which is very frustrating. So then what do? Well, then you try to, mitigate and or minimize the kind of damage. You're doing damage control. So, it's a very tough call and it's painful to watch. But I always tell people, look, if you stayed married, your child is going to witness this. They're going to witness the domestic violence. They're going to witness the alcoholism. And you're going to wind up living somebody else's life because you're going to walk on eggshells. You're going to be in that position of always trying to protect them. And guess what? You can't do it because the kids already know what's going on. So, I really firmly believe in being your own life preserver first and then doing the damage control for your children because and that's a tough thing to overcome because as parents none of us want to hurt our children
Right.
and yet that decision, should I stay, should I go, is ultimately it's going to hurt your child no matter what you do. So you have to learn to forgive yourself, accept the situation that you're in and the situation that your children are in, and be as transparent as you can with them. I mean, depending on their age, of course, some of them are too young to recognize it. But I think the best thing you can do for your children is to be a good communicator with the other parent,
Mm.
to try to co-parent and not frustrate that relationship because the parents' relationships in most instances is very different from the children's relationship with their parents.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, those are wise words. That's for sure. Now, marriage counseling. When do you think people should enter marriage counseling? Benefits? I'll tell you my example with this, my experience was we were married for, like I said, 23 years, but more than halfway through, things were going very poorly. And I sat my wife back then, my ex-wife, down. I said, we should go to marriage counseling. And she's like, no. And I'm like, well, it makes sense that, we do this. She didn't want any part of it. So I said, you know what? Screw you. I'm doing it myself. So I went to a marriage counselor by myself and she was awesome. She reminded me of the lady that was the principal in Kindergarten Cop. She was like 4'10", kind of a mousy voice, but she made so much sense. And, we just started talking and she's just like, you shouldn't be married to that woman. And I'm like, well, wait, you're a marriage counselor. I thought you fixed these things. She says, no, that's not my job. She says, you have kids. Nothing is going to change that. There's going to be birthdays and, birthdays, weddings, funerals, whatever, graduations. You have to be able to co-parent with your ex-wife. And she said, I'll help you with that. And she said, and by the way, you just have a mountain load of PTSD. And I'm like, I do? I didn't even know it. Yeah, it's like, okay. So she wanted to help me with that as well. And I never realized that, there's a lot of aha moments that I thought, well, I'll just go to this marriage counselor. he or she will say whatever and everything's gonna be hunky dory. And it wasn't even close to that. I had very unrealistic expectations with that. So what's your experience with that? When do you think it's best to do that? And what do you do if you have a spouse that doesn't want to go with?
Well, I think, I mean, that's the first thing is there has to be some kind of meeting of the minds, right? You're already in a contract because you're married. If both people do not want to try to fix what's wrong, then you can't force the other person to go to marriage counseling. But I do agree with what you said about getting counseling for yourself, because I think that it's really important to have your eyes wide open as you're going through this, because, you know, there just may be core values, fundamental issues that you cannot overcome in that relationship. And it's important to accept that, change what you can, accept what you can't, right? And move
Right.
forward. And to your point, I mean, there are many reasons people, will divorce and or stay. And so, if the marriage counselor says to you, can you live with what's happening now? Can you live with what's happening and not lose yourself? Then, maybe you work on it. If you can't live with what's happening and you're losing yourself, then you go to marriage counseling for yourself to work on the things that you need to be aware of, to repair, to heal, and to move forward. So I think that counseling is very beneficial, whether you stay in the marriage or not. But I think in most of the cases that I've dealt with, it's usually one person going to counseling.
Oh, okay. I thought I was weird or something, but
Yeah.
okay, I'm
Because
not.
a
Well, I'm
lot of
weird, but not that not that way.
no, because I think a lot of times, and I actually think it's a tell too. If your spouse does not want to go to counseling, that should be a red flag to you. That should be an indicator that that spouse does not want to be told something is wrong with them, right?
Oh,
They
okay.
don't want to
Yeah,
walk in.
because you are vulnerable when you go to somebody like that. That person should be impartial and hear, what's going on. And yeah, you know what? I never thought of it that way. Yes.
Yeah, they don't want to fix it, and they don't want to, I mean, it takes work, really. I mean, when you work on yourself, right, to
Oh,
become a
right.
better person. And so a lot of people, they can be led to the water, but they won't be drinking it. So I
Sure.
think that's another maybe stepping stone in deciding whether or not you're going to stay in the marriage. So if you try marriage counseling and only one of you goes, it's time to, you know, cut the cord.
Sure. Now, you keep on going back to core values, and I absolutely love that because that's so encompassing. I was going to backtrack and go a little bit over like causes of divorce, but it keeps on circling back to the core values because, it's like, okay, money. You know, we have different ideas when it comes to money, and it comes back to core values. Sometimes religion. It's like I've been around people that they were married to somebody that is either atheist, agnostic, or you know, Catholic with a little C, like me. Just not super religious, and their spouse finds God and they're like born again, and that causes a lot of stress if you're not both on the same sheet of music with that.
Yeah, that can be a deal breaker. I think you really have to know, you have to you have to be true to yourself. I know that sounds really, hokey, but it's really
It's
it's true.
not
You have to know
right.
who you are, because if you find yourself compromising your core values to please somebody else or to stay in the marriage, you're not in an equal marriage. And that's really important, right? You have to be there. So I always tell people there are three people in a marriage, right? There's there's you, your spouse, and then there's the relationship, capital R.
Mm,
So you're doing things, you have yourselves to take care of, and then you have to have a meeting of the minds of what is good for the relationship. And if you can come together on what is good for the relationship, then you have some solid footing to continue to maybe work on that relationship and heal that relationship. If there isn't that capital R, then the two of you are either too single, you're on these single paths going in different directions, or worse, if there's just one of you in the relationship. Like
mm,
if you have one person who's controlling the ship and the other person who's just pleasing, who's just being enmeshed in that other person's wishes, desires, and values. And none of those scenarios are good unless you're in an equal relationship. And I think that takes some work, because I think a lot of people, myself included, when I was married, was, is this equal? And I think that's what happens when you start, when you get married really young, you're not really thinking about that.
Right,
But,
right.
but your career start to, increase. A lot of times people are not even in their careers when they get married, right? I mean, I was 22.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
I
Yep.
mean, I didn't even know anything really at that time. So
Sure.
you're really just sort of, incubating together, right? And then you add children to the mix, and now you're parents, and you don't even know what kind of parent you are until you have children.
Absolutely. Yes.
You really don't. And so, so that's really what I always advise people is, where is that capital R? Because if it's not there, it's not going to work.
Interesting. Now, speaking of kids, if you have children, and this also depends on their age and their maturity level, which don't always coincide.
Mhm.
Best practices for breaking the news to the kids. What happened to me, and it should be noted that they're going to remember this forever. This is like one of those big events in life that stick in your craw for a long time. You're going to remember when your spouse either said, "Hey, I'm filing for divorce against you," or you're saying, "Hey, this isn't working. I'm going to file for divorce against you," or however which way you want to like phrase it. But when you break the news to the kids, I mean, the way it worked with us was I was working late power shift, which was 7 at night till 3 in the morning, and I was trying to get some sleep. And my soon-to-be ex, we already talked about it. It's like, yeah, this is probably a good idea that we get divorced. It was amicable at first, and she woke me up like at 11 o'clock in the morning. I was only sleeping for like maybe 5 hours. If she said, "We got to tell the kids right now," and I'm like, I don't even know what day it is. I'm like in this fog. And she's like, "We're doing it right now." So she's marching kids, she's marching them into the kitchen. I'm like, oh my God. So we're sit down, and she looks at me and she says, "Your dad has something to tell you." And I'm
Oh,
like, "You bitch." Oh my God. And my kids were both smiling, and I'm like, "Why are they smiling?" And they're like, "We already know. Mom, you should be a lot more careful with your phone calls." I mean, my one son was like 14 or 15, the other one was 11. And I tell you what, they're incredibly perceptive. They're great sleuths. They know what you're saying on the phone. You think you're being all slick, you're not. They know. And, it's like what I told them, and I suggested this to other people that have gone through it, is it's like I told, and now I'm just making this up because I'm literally in the fog of, I'm still not 100% awake, but that jilted me. And I'm like, it is true. Your mom and dad are getting divorced, but we are still a family. Nothing is ever going to change that. It's just going to be a little bit different now. As far as spending time with each other, we both love you very much, and nothing is going to change that. So I can't stress enough how you got to reassure them. You got to make them, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but don't give them false hope. Don't be a Disney movie that, at the end, the parents, rejoin again in some wacky zany way or whatever. That's horrible. That they shouldn't even make those movies. But
right.
what do you think are some best practices?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that it is, I mean, divorce, in my opinion, is worse than a death, because it's something that is, well, it's long lasting, right? It's going to, you're grieving it each time you're reopening that wound.
Mhm.
Whereas a death, you have some closure, you have opportunity to heal, maybe move on from it. With a divorce, you don't. You're right. That's the line in the sand. It's the line of demarcation, and you are a divorced child, child of divorced parents or parents that are divorced. And so I think there's an overwhelming sort of grief and sadness that hangs in the balance when you're going through it, not only for the person that's going through it, but now you've really got to be sort of brave and strong for your children,
Absolutely.
and not tell them, I cannot stress this enough, do not tell them the nitty gritty of the reasons why you're getting divorced. Because first of all, they don't care. Second of all, it's so painful for them because they love both parents.
Right.
And they don't want to be in the middle of this. They don't want to be in a war, a custody battle, where one parent, one child is being asked, who would you rather live with?
Yep.
It's horrible. And secondly, the children, I mean, what they really care about is they care, like, their security, their safety is going away. That's what they think. So they want to know, where are they going to live? When are they going to see you? When
Yep.
are they going to see the other parent, right? What's happening in their world? Because remember, they're very self-centered, in that respect, in a good way, because their world is their world. And so when you come in and your relationship issues then suddenly permeate their world, it's devastating for them. And my children were teenagers as well when it happened. And I made the, mistake of thinking that the older the children are, the easier it is on
Mm,
them. And it's not.
it's
In
not.
fact, it's really not. And I don't think that there is a good time, actually, to get a divorce. I think it's devastating no matter when you do it. And it is disruptive. It's disruptive for the children, no matter what you do. And I know that the first knee-jerk reaction, and just to answer your question initially, is I do believe that both parents need to be involved in the telling of it. Because if they're not, then it becomes a blame game. And then it immediately hits one parent as the bad guy, which is not fair to the kids. And whether it's true or not, it's not fair to the kids, because they don't want to be in that position. They want to be told information is currency, it's powerful. They want to be reassured. So, I tell clients, keep it brief, keep it simple, but reassure them that you're going to do everything in your power to make it a smooth transition, but know in your mind it's not going to be for them.
Yeah, that's probably one of the toughest things I've ever done. There's no doubt about that, because you don't want to break their little hearts. It's tough, but it has to be done. So do it right. Yeah, just do it the right way. Okay. When is it time to get a lawyer? I think, we went over some of that, as far as, probably if even if you're not hell bent on getting divorced, probably not a bad idea to get a reality check, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Have a consultation
Yeah,
with somebody. I mean, most lawyers will give a free consultation. You just call them up, and that's when you start interviewing them too. See if you like the advice they're giving you. I
sure.
mean, if you've never been divorced, you want to kind of know what your rights are. Can you stay in the house? Can you know, will you be able to see your kids if one of you leaves, for example?
Right.
How are you going to live if you haven't been in the workforce for a long time? I mean, all of those things are really valid and, scary concerns.
Sure. Now, what do you think about sharing an attorney? I think I might know the answer, but go ahead.
I have had some cases where people want to share me. And the way that I preface that is it's it only ever works in an uncontested divorce. And there are so few uncontested divorces that I actually don't recommend it. But what I will tell clients that want to do that is, if I'm doing a decree, like I'm drafting up a contract, then I'm going to advise, one of them to go and show that contract to another lawyer and make sure that they're
Mm,
satisfied with it. So they get a consultation on the contract. And
okay.
that way I don't feel like I'm manipulating anything or they're getting a raw deal on anything. But yeah, I mean, sometimes people will do that. They'll use the same lawyer.
Yeah, I've had friends that have done it and acquaintances, and I know a couple that actually worked out very well, and I've known some that it really didn't at all, and you wind up getting another attorney and you wind up spending even more money, more heartburn. And the way I would explain it to people that ask me about it was, your attorney is your advocate. You want them in your corner. They're your guy or gal, fighting for you. It's kind of hard to be playing it both ways, if you're sharing that attorney.
Right. It really is.
So, tips for moving out. You know, there's gonna come that time if you're going through that divorce. I guess it would be the separation. because none of this happens quickly and it goes kind of in stages, and it's time to move out. You know, my ex-wife moved out, and I thought before it happened, I talked to my attorney about it, and he's like, okay, well, once she moves out, you're going to have to start paying child support. There's going to be, a court hearing, and, you make double what she makes. So, be prepared for that. And I said, well, what about like property? And he says, there are services that will come to your house and like divvy it up. He said it'd be much better if you talk it over and like two adults and come to an agreement. Well, I thought I did. And I said, let's be, civil about this. You're leaving, your parents bought you a house, and I have, we have stuff together from, 20 some odd years of being married, you know, just take what you think is fair. Well, and I'm just going away that weekend. I don't want to be around for it, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, okay, sounds good. I came back,
That's right.
and it was like the Grinch came to the house. The only
Yeah.
thing that was left was a torn up couch, a torn up chair, a TV that worked maybe half the time, and a kitchen table. I had no appliances. I had nothing. I had my clothes and toiletries and two dogs that she didn't want. And I mean, nothing else. It was like I said, like the Grinch came. And what
Yeah.
and what really hurt the most was, okay, the stove, the refrigerator, the house that she moved into had those things. It had a washer and dryer. It had a stove. It had a refrigerator, but she had to take all that from me.
Yeah. That's where it degrades into spite or, anger. It's like you get the leftovers. It's like my favorite book is Waiting to Exhale, where the woman's getting divorced and she sells everything in the house for $1. She has a yard sale and sells it for $1. So that's more of like the revenge property thing. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the and I made that same assumption. So you're not alone in that, where people they want to play nice, they want to be
Right.
fair, and they are operating under the assumption that the other person is going to be just as reasonable and rational. And the the bit that we forget is the emotional part of it.
Yep.
There's so much emotion charged with that, with possessions, with things that you collected over the years of marriage, the sentimental value of things, that I think it's very hard to play with a rational deck. And I think, even with that, it's really important to come up with a list, to treat it like a corporate entity. As really cold and detached as that sounds, that is what you're doing. You came together in love, but you are separating for practical reasons.
Right.
So if you treat it as a corporate entity and you're looking at it financially, and that's the reason people get lawyers, right? It's because now you've commingled assets and it's a financial entity that you now have to dissolve fairly. So I think even with possessions, it's important to just make a list and make sure that somebody's checking it twice, and have a witness, and you take photographs of things. I mean, it's
Sure.
everything. Everything is litigation.
Yeah, and I was just trying to be chivalrous. I'm trying to be the guy,
Forget
trying to
it.
be that nice guy, but that blew up in my face really quick. But
Yeah.
lesson learned. And you know what? Yeah, it was very tough at first, but I figured it out. You always do. Um so again, being very specific is, splitting everything up. And one thing that kind of I wasn't prepared for is, okay, now we're living apart. Okay, now I've got to get a different phone plan. I have to get my own car insurance, where before, things were all bundled together. Now they're not. So that's just one more thing to, put on the list.
Yeah. Financially, it's definitely a pinch. I mean, for both sides, really, because you're used to living as a couple and you're used, like you said, sharing things and everything now, and then you're suddenly a single person. So it's really an adjustment. for both ends, to say, okay, now I've got to figure this out,
Right.
figure out how I'm going to do it on my own.
Yep. So mediation, we had court ordered mediation, and I went to the mediator, and the mediator was a family attorney that, did this on the side or as a part of their practice. Pros and cons, ours was horrible. It was probably one of the worst experiences I ever had. And I'm used to interviewing people. I was used to, negotiating was a big part of my job. And before I was a cop, I sold cars for 4 years. So I have the negotiator inside of me, but it was totally in really poor faith on her side. And the mediator did nothing to push that needle. What advice do you have regarding mediators?
Well, I do think mediation is very valuable. And I think that anytime that you can come to agreements is better than going to trial. Because once you go to trial, particularly in family court, you have very limited time. So it's not like a criminal trial where you can go for months. In a family court trial, you're lucky if you get 3 hours to half a day to litigate issues that are really critical to your life and moving on. So I am a firm proponent of mediation. However, what I think you're describing is court appointed mediation. And sometimes you're going there and the philosophy is if you guys can't make any agreements, then you're just going to go to trial and we're not going to like massage this or negotiate this. Whereas if you go to private mediation, where sometimes you get a retired judge, maybe if you're lucky, a retired judge who was once the, family court presiding judge,
Right.
somebody who is not the judge of your case is going to sit there and really negotiate those terms and tell both sides, this is what you're looking at. If you go to trial or you stay. And a lot of times, I mean, I do this, I participate as a lawyer in mediation. So we get the lawyers on both sides and the clients to sit down at a conference table and say, what are we fighting about? Because it is cost effective. It's, maintaining control over the litigation. You're reaching agreements that, you're, for the most part, are going to be palatable. But, you're not walking away. Nobody's getting everything that they want because that's part of compromise and part of mediation. But I do think it's a very valuable tool because once you give it up to the court in that very short span of time, then the judge is deciding, deciding custody, deciding, your parenting time, and you may not like it at the end of the day, but then it becomes a court order.
Yeah. Like I said, the first mediation was horrible because she came in with a script and it was so obvious, from her attorney. And she said, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, he's a child abuser. And I'm like, my jaw dropped on the ground. I'm like, and this is the attorney that was just horrible.
Yeah.
And the mediator looks at me and I look at him and I'm like, well, this is news to me. Um, what do you mean? So she explains an incident that happened where my 15-year-old woke me up, during the day. He was fighting with his brother, which is what brothers do. And as I walk into the kitchen, he punches the 11-year-old as hard as he can in the stomach, and the 11-year-old goes down like a ton of bricks. So I run in there and, I jack him up against the wall. And I'm like, if you ever do that again, blah, 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 blah. And I said, do we understand each other? And he says, yes. And he started crying a little bit. And I said, pick up your brother off the floor. And I said, give him a hug, tell him you love him, and don't wake me up ever again. And I said, this is ridiculous. So I went back to bed. And she said, yeah, he did this. That's child abuse. And I'm like, no, it's not. That you can correct your children. You can do these things. And, this guy's an attorney. That's the mediator. I said, could you please explain what physical abuse to a child is? That's the Wisconsin state statute. I said, I deal with this at work all the time. Could you please? No, I can't do that. I said, the statute book is right behind you. I'll find it for you. I know where it is. It's not a big mystery. Could you please? No, I can't take sides. It's not taking sides. I want you to recite a state statute, please.
Right.
No, I can't do that. I'm like, okay, this went nowhere.
See, that's kind of useless. I mean, if you go to private mediation, though, you've got more of a shot at really coming out with, an argument. I mean, once somebody is levying accusations like that, it's almost hopeless. You can't mediate because now they're just too interested in making it, acrimonious rather than,
Right.
and
And what it
so
was is, again, it's circling back. She had a horrible attorney that shouldn't be an attorney, and he was giving her really bad advice. And she wound up firing him after a year into it.
oh my God. Yeah. See
So
that?
now we're starting all over again. Yeah, and it's like, so she hired this high-speed law office that was downtown, and it was all women that worked there. And they charged an incredibly high amount of money. I'm sure, they told them that, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, but I'll give them credit because it was never one attorney, it was usually two. And I'll give them credit. They were even telling her, it's like, that's not realistic. That's not going to happen. But she just wouldn't want to hear it.
Yeah. And that's a shame. I mean, it happens. It happens where you're giving advice, you're giving sound advice, and the client's not following it. And and unfortunately it jacks up the fees, and
Oh,
there's, the
yeah,
divorce lasts 3 to 4 years, it's just terrible.
yes. Oh boy. So now you're separated, you're living apart from each other, and for some it's a very sad time, and for some they're jumping for joy. Yeah, I told people, you know what, you're living under a microscope when you're going through this process, especially if your partner is hurling accusations of X, Y, or Z at you. I said you should be living like a monk. You should be like, just play it cool. This is not going to be forever. I know you might be excited about being single again, quote unquote, but this is not the time to throw a party. This is not the time to do anything crazy. It's like, hey, I'm going to go on this great vacation now and this and that. And it said, A, your children are watching. They know what's going on. And B, do you really want to be that guy? Because we got a guardian ad litem, and that's the attorney for the kids, because the whole sticking point was she wanted 100% placement in custody, that I shouldn't have them at all. And I'm like, no. So we start all over again with a guardian ad litem. Now, do you deal with that quite a bit with your practice?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes we have like a court appointed advisor. The court, there's so much animosity, the court just needs, they need an expert to tell him, what is really going on here, because they can't sift through the barbs being thrown at both sides. So they want to
Sure.
know, is there any merit to what somebody's saying about the other parent? And so I think it's pretty useful to have a best interest counsel or a court advisor or somebody to investigate and report back to the court. I mean, there are pros and cons with that too, of course. I mean, you've got like, the report that person generates is usually dispositive of the case. And so it makes further negotiation difficult. So when it goes to that level and the court has the information that they need, oftentimes it's just a done deal. You can't negotiate any differently. So it can be a double-edged sword depending on the information that the court advisor receives.
Yeah. And what made me nervous about this was some stranger is now going to be deciding the fate of my children. The fate of how often I'm going to see them or interact with them or whatever the case may be. And that's sobering. That's a wake up. That's a slap in the face.
Yeah, like everything that you've done in your life is under a microscope.
Absolutely. So,
Every email you write, every social media you
oh,
post, that you do is now under a microscope, and it's fair game in litigation.
yeah, they're investigating you. And I would tell my friends or coworkers or whoever, it's like, okay, you have a guardian ad litem. I said, now is the time to live like a monk. Now is the time not to do stupid stuff. I mean, yeah, you might have a pity party or whatever, so be it, but don't make that an every night occasion.
Right.
Don't be, there's certain things that you shouldn't be doing. And like I said, my default was try to live like a monk and you'll be okay. But the smear campaigns and the exaggerations and the lies,
Yeah,
this guardian ad litem is going to be, like you said, investigating you. And I remember one time guardian ad litem called me and she's like, your wife said that you last month you called her more than, it was like 500 or 600 times. I'm like, what? And left messages and did this and did that. And I'm like, the only time I talk to her on the phone is, like, who's picking up the kid, or, there's basketball practice tonight, or whatever the case may be. I said, I don't want to talk to her all that much right now. She's not my favorite person. And she said, well, and I said, well, tell you what, I can print up my phone bill, and that has the numbers, how long, there's paper trails for everything.
Yeah, well, and as a former cop, I'm sure that you,
Oh
you
yeah.
like,
So I almost got giddy. I'm like, oh, I could disprove this in 2 seconds. So
yeah,
I literally printed up my phone bill, highlighted when I called her or she called me, and it was in 1 month, I think it was like 10 or 15 times. And
yeah, and that's just it. It's so unproductive, especially if there's no merit to any of it. It's just unproductive to be, amassing this like arsenal of information against the other person. Because at the end of the day, again, it comes back to the children,
right.
whether or not they're going to see both parents. And at the end of the day, in most states, they are. So how much do you want to fight over, mudslinging the other person? I mean, everybody understands you're getting divorced because you don't like each other anymore, or it's not working anymore. But there's no point in perpetuating that or exacerbating that. Just keep it focused on the end game, which is get divorced and make sure your kids are okay.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, some of this is money motivated, because she knew that, it's like, well, if I have the kids 100% of the time, I'm gonna have a big fat, child support check every week. I mean, every month, et cetera. You know, and instead of what's best for the kids, I'll cut to the chase. Towards the end of my divorce, the guardian ad litem says, I am very tempted to give you 100%. She is she said, I'm so sick of all the BS, blah, blah, blah. Again, if you exaggerate, if you lie, if you have these smear campaigns, they're counterproductive. They're not going to help your case. And she was so angry. She's like, I said, you know what? All I want is 50, because at the end of the day, they need mom, they need dad. It's that simple. And I'd be a hypocrite if I did that. And I knew it was going to cost me more, but that's fine. At the end of the day, I wanted what was best for the kids. So after 2 years and a whole lot of money and a whole lot of grief, guess what? That what I had on that steno pads going to Starbucks is exactly what we wound up with.
And that's usually what happens. It's just amazing. Like you'll spend all this time in between fighting, and at the end of the day, you're going to wind up with exactly what you started with.
Yeah, just speaking of kids, somebody told me, it's like, keep an eye on them. I think it was my attorney. And it's like, this is a very tough time for them. If you see any like dangerous behaviors, obviously drugs, alcohol, anything like that, and there's nothing wrong with, therapy. Even if everything seems honky-dory, maybe 1 or 2 sessions with a therapist that they can rely on and trust, and that's in their corner, and they feel like, hey, they're there for me. you know I strongly suggest that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they need somebody that they can confide in, and just talk to. It doesn't have to be,
Absolutely.
it just has to be for that moment.
Absolutely. So when do you think people should reconcile? Have you ever had people like in the middle of a divorce and say, no, we fell back in love again, no, we don't want this divorce?
Yeah, I've had it happen frequently, actually. And I
Really?
think that, I think my comment on that is, I mean, it's different for everybody, and it's an incredibly emotionally charged time in your life. And I think that because people have so much invested in the marriage, oftentimes they will see what they can kind of put aside. They ask themselves, what can I live with? And I guess it comes back to, what are you willing to live with, and what are you losing by being willing to live with that?
Mm,
And sometimes, I'll give you an example. I mean, sometimes people reconcile after an affair. So an affair happens and it's shattering to the marriage. And so they have a knee-jerk reaction. They want to get divorced. And so they're midway through the divorce process. And then they realize, you know what, maybe it's not worth splitting up, because of the affair, because maybe the affair was a one night stand. Maybe it's no longer even in the picture. You know, like there are any number of reasons that are different for every situation, but I have seen that happen. The times where I feel that it is really dangerous and detrimental to reconcile is if the spouse has decided to divorce based on an abusive relationship.
Mm,
They've gotten the courage up to finally leave,
yeah.
and then they're sucked back in by the same sort of abusive psychological behavior
Mm,
that kept them trapped in that marriage. That's when I think it's dangerous. And I have seen that happen as well. You know, where they get a peek to the other side, they get a little nervous because the financial
right.
stability is not
Yep.
there. And they say, you know, maybe it's worth it. Maybe I can just suppress who I really am, live somebody else's life, but have that financial security. That's when I think it's really dangerous. But, you know, I have seen it.
Gotcha. So you get divorced, the dust is settled, and the dust does settle. It is, the best way I could explain it was, all right, it's done, it's over. It's almost like a battle, and it doesn't have to be, but it turned out that way, etc. And the sooner you get on with your lives, the sooner it's better off for everybody, including the children. Now you're single, and it's time to start dating again. That's a very daunting, for some, it's very daunting. It can be kind of spooky. And I made some rules myself as far as dating when you have kids. And I br- I pass these on to my friends that were newly divorced, and I'll be more than happy to now. It's like, okay, give yourself some time. Only you know when it's okay to start dating again. Be safe about it. Hey, the old cliches of like meeting in a public place, etc. I think those are great. I think those are good practices. And you were married for 23, 27 years. It's not going to just come back right away. And as far as your kids go, nobody met my children unless I was dating you for at least 6 months to a year.
I think that's really wise advice because you don't want to put them through that again. If
Right.
it's not gonna last, you know, if it's a somebody you're not serious about and then you're introducing them to the family or you're trying to get them enmeshed in your life. I mean, it's so complicated, it's so traumatic. I mean, and the kids are very likely to say, look, don't involve me in your relationships. You know,
Yeah.
and that can be tough too, because, you know, you're trying to reestablish some foothold. You're trying to, you know, in your mind, you're thinking, oh, maybe I'll try something that is stable again or stabilizing. The kids are not seeing it that way. You know, they want mom or they want dad, and they're going to always be comparing that person to, you know, their parent. You just have to give them time, I think, and I think that's the key to introducing people to them. You know, doing it gradually, doing it in a way that you have to first be committed and serious, so that you're not re-wounding them.
Right. We're not 16-year-olds anymore. It's like I had friends that, they got divorced or separated and they went out and they were acting like teenagers again. And it's like, I'm not, I would start dating and I wasn't looking for my forever wife, right away or whatever the case may be. But I definitely wasn't some, teenager. It's like, okay, you want companionship, you want to, have a relationship, whatever. That's normal. It's normal and it's natural. But boy, it is daunting, and it's I had some crazy experiences when I started dating before I met, I'm remarried happily, and we met, with internet dating,
Mhm.
one of those sites. And I was ready to just throw my phone in the garbage because
Mhm. Share that experience.
I had instances where it was very nice women that we weren't a match, but we just had a pleasant evening together. Then I had complete psychos that I'm just like, where did this come from? Oh my Lord. It's like,
Can't wait for the
wow.
meal to end fast enough.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yes.
I'll make
So
you coffee.
yeah, Do you have any best practices or advice for anybody that's going through that?
Um, Honestly, I think it's just important to take your time,
Yeah.
because I think there's no reason to rush into things. I think it sets sort of a dangerous precedent if you're not sure yourself. Like if you have not fully healed from the relationship, I mean, you have to heal. It's a long marriage that you were in. There were obviously, some good and some bad, but you have to make sure that you've, resolved whatever it was coming out of that relationship. So I think that's like the biggest maybe mistake people make early on is they haven't fully healed because it is, in my opinion, worse than a death. And so you have to give yourself room to grieve and get over that for yourself. And then you're grieving for your children, so it's definitely difficult. But I mean, I concur with you. I think you have to be strategic about when you introduce that significant other to your children, be realistic. They're not going to embrace that person, fully unless they've had time to process, they've had
Right.
this traumatic event happen, it's going to take them a little time to get over that and get past that.
Yeah.
So I think for all of those reasons to, just take your time, be careful.
Yep. Don't push anything. Just like you said, all in good time. Just yeah, absolutely. So co-parenting, dating, this is the end, and I think this is a good place for us to end our conversation. Be a good co-parent. Don't Again, it's so easy to say, it's like, well, your mom did X, Y, and Z, or your dad was this or that. Leave that, just stay out of that with your kids, because that's still mom, it's still dad. It's If you had an evil, mother-in-law, you know what, you don't have to talk about it. It's still grandma, it's still grandpa, it's to them. Let them have their childhood.
Right. Let them have their childhood and remember you if nothing else, you made these great kids together.
You're
You
right.
know? So that's really important to remember. It's like you can't, once upon a time you loved this other person and you loved them enough to bring these children in. Maybe now you don't like them, but just don't lose sight of that that's what brought that's the reason that you're still together.
All right, that's the perfect place for us to end. Thank you so much, Carrie. This is a lot of fun with a very sensitive subject, but hey, I think we did pretty good with it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure. I'm glad that you wrote the book and you can help other people with that
Okay.
too. It's
All
great.
right, you betcha. All right, thank you.